Pesach Ovadyah is a former staff member of the University of Western Ontario and recent graduate of UWO, where he majored in political science. He's also a board member of Congregation Beth Tefillah in London, Ontario. Pesach is also the chair of the London chapter of the Jewish Defence League, which was formed in 2009. The Jewish Defence League of Canada is committed to restoration of pride and integrity to the Jewish people, the return of Jewish values, the reclamation of the Jewish sense of justice, and the abolition of hatred and bigotry. In starting a chapter in London, Pesach is a very important part of the expansion of the goal of Rabbi Kahane to give Jews some feeling of self-respect and pride in that they have the moral right to defend themselves in any and all situations. Pesach often finds himself in one way or another on the front lines defending Israel or defending those who defend Israel. He and others from the JDL generously give their time and their expertise in security to stand with speakers who are likely to draw the ire of the usual suspects, like Geert Wilders, for example. They have always been reliable partners for IFPS and for those who want to attend our events but have little faith that the police and the on-site security people will do their job. Having their assistance and support of Pesach and the JDL makes all the difference in the world for the cause of free speech and open debate. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Pesach Ovadyah.
Excellent, thank you. Mark, I just want to thank you for, this guy's great, he's phenomenal. When we heard about the disruption of the, oh, sorry, yeah. Okay, this one, okay, sorry there, let me get a bit, there you go. Just want to, again, thank Mark for his phenomenal work and bringing this event to us. As he stated earlier, in the conference, the reasoning for bringing this about was because of the fact that there was a shutdown of an event, Israeli Day at UWO, and that event's been going on for past 3 or 4 or 5 years, as far as I can remember, and the mere fact that it was shut down, the lack of respect for another group's right to free speech is why we're here today. And mainly, the reason why we're here today is because people don't want to hear the truth. They don't want to hear what's going on that's real. And so therefore, they feel they can inhibit others by just basically shutting them down and creating problems for us. So Mark, thank you. It was great working with you. He worked tirelessly to do all of this, and I'm just proud to have him as a friend, and I think I should give you a hand for that. Okay, the Jewish case for Israel. The Israeli flag would be a moot point if we really didn't have a Jewish case for Israel, and I'm going to elaborate on why I think that is, because our history is based on Torah, the 5 books of Moses. We start off with one of the more famous verses in the Bible that we know, in Genesis, where it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." And from that point on, it was where the ball starts to roll. I'll give 15 minutes is a short time. It could probably take a conference in itself to talk about the history of the Jewish land and the people and so forth. But in 15 minutes, I'm going to try to compress all this and give you a general overview of what I think is important, arguing for the state of Israel and the case for Israel. One of the verses that comes to mind is that God tells Jewish people, and I might jump around here a bit and use certain terminology, and I'll translate as well. But he says, "I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given, that I have given." And this is important because, to start this all off, there's a man by the name of Avram. And he was an idol worshiper. He was a Chaldean, as they say. And he lived in a town called Kasdim. And God called him out. He said, you know what, Avram, I think, I need somebody to worship me. I need somebody to recognize who I am. And so what he does is, Avram, being the man that he was, hey, okay, God, I hear your call. And I'll come out and I'll follow you. And so God said, I'm going to give you a land, since you're going to follow me. And it's going to be a land where, your people can dwell. And this particular land was called Canaan at the time. So what the Pasuk tells us, the verse tells us, is that God says, I will give you a land, and basically it will start from the river, East River of Egypt, to the river, to the west, to the east, the river Euphrates, and you'll dwell there. And so Avram takes his family and he goes. As the story goes, he discovers that, God wants to do more. God makes another promise to him. He says, you know what, I want your descendants to be like the stars in the heaven, the Chochavim, the stars, Ve'ashemayim. They will number, your descendants will be of that number. If we look up in the sky, there's lots of stars, especially if we have a dark night. And he said, I have a promise for you, Avram. And his name is later changed to Abraham, so I'll jump to that. I'll give you this land and your descendants this land, if you follow me, if you obey me. Very simple. So Avram says, okay, I'll do that. I'll obey you, I'll follow you. And from here we see that the land of Israel as we know it today is born. So if we can show on a map the first slide. This is the area that God promised Abraham and his descendants. And you can tell the river Euphrates to the east and to the Mediterranean to the west. And it's a very large land. Now most people would think that in a situation like this, that Abraham could just walk in and take possession. But he had some issues, he had some trouble. There were some people in that land. If we look at the map here, we see that the Hittites were there, the Kadmonites were there, the Ammonites were there, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, and so forth. And they were in the land. And this is where it gets kind of sticky with most people, because they say, oh, well, they went to war and they did terrible things, and how come God's not a God of love? And, why are men fighting and this type of thing? And basically, Abraham had to go in to do a job. God said, conquer the land. You have to drive them out. This is one of the issues of contention today right now with the wars of '67, with this Nakba Day that the Arabs have. The Jews, they came in, they rose up from the Holocaust, so to speak, and they just took our land. And clearly, if you look in the Bible to those who are Christians and those who are Jews as well, we'll know that the land was already proclaimed long ago. It's very clear. Whether you believe it or not, it's up to you. But this is what the Torah tells us, and this is what we teach, and this is what we stand on, and this is our foundation. Okay. And from this point on, history is unraveled as I'll go a bit further and mention that Avraham and Sarah, his wife, were together, and God says to him one day, guess what? You're going to have a child. And Sarah's age is fairly old at this point. She kind of doubts it. She says, well, I'm too old to have a child. But nonetheless, God's a man, a person of his word. And so she eventually has a child. But before that happens, she has a bit of doubt. Take this handmaiden, Hagar, and basically procreate with her, and we'll see what happens. And so they do. And when they do, the handmaiden has a son, and his name is Ishmael. And the first thing God says in that, and I won't say it in the Hebrew, but I'll just translate, paraphrasing. It says his hand, his yad, his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand will be against him. And he'll go off, and he'll make war against his brothers. But God says he's not the promised child. Very clear. Because when we talk about the Torah and the covenant that God made with the Jewish people, we talk about land rights. We talk about the covenant, and we look at it from the standpoint that God has a better plan. And he did. And so Ishmael and Hagar, he gets older, they're sent off. God says, you know what, you'll be a great nation, but you'll be at enmity against your brother. It's a key point you have to understand. And so, eventually, Sarah has a child, and his name is Yitzhak. And Yitzhak grows up, and he becomes a great skilled individual. And then he has offspring, Yaakov. And then Yaakov, basically, his name is changed to Israel. And from that point on, the generations of the Jews begin. Fast forwarding a bit, Israel's enslaved in Egypt. And so, finally they're delivered. And when they're delivered, God says to Moses at the time, he says, I have some laws for you. And I'll give you these laws. And these laws are going to be given to you on Har Sinai. So Moses said, okay, great. I'll follow you, God. I'll go up to the mountain. And he talks to God. He comes back down. The laws are given. And a proclamation is made at that point. Some of the rabbis say it's during the time of Avram. There's different opinions on who it is, but where I'm going with it is I believe that at that point the Jewish people were duly noted by God. And they're told, you're going to have to go into the land that I've given you, the land that's flowing with milk and honey. It's haaretz, chalav, udavash. And so, but there's a problem. And he tells Moses, there's a problem. There's some people in that land, and you're going to have to go in there. You're going to have to drive them out. You have to go to war with them. And a lot of people who are politically correct, when they hear things like that, they're kind of like, well, why do they do something like that? Why do they sit down and talk about this? Why can't they, negotiate? There was no negotiating. Because God gave a direct order, obedience. There's a pasuk that says obedience is better than sacrifice. And when we're not obedient, we get the kind of results that we get in Israel today. Most people would say, well, why would you say that should the Palestinians or the people who call themselves Palestinians be driven out of the land? Well, if it was said back then, why not? Because when you're in enmity against God and against the people of God, the Jewish people are the apple of God's eye. That's first and foremost. That's what David HaMelech said in the Psalms. And that stands. Whatever God says, stands. We follow that. Some of us, we doubt, but eventually we find out the hard way. And so, in this struggle that we have between Ishmael, the descendants of Ishmael, and the descendants of Yaakov, to this day, we have the kind of violence that we see against us. The foundation for the Jewish state was not just based on a document, the Balfour Declaration, but it was a document written by God, the Torah. That's what we've been following. If we go again using anything else, we're going to fail. We're going to falter. So, going a bit further here, we read in the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, and God says very clearly, this is one pasuk I picked out, that the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, and for you are strangers and sojourners in the land. To your descendants I've given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. And so, putting two verses together, this is a clear law, that the land is not to be negotiated. Not to underscore what Mark has said, but this is why I don't carry a Palestinian flag in my pocket, because of what the value of what the Torah has said, has written to us. It's not that I hate Arabs. I don't. I don't despise anybody. But those things that God hates, I hate, as David writes in the Tehillim or the Psalms. And when you're an enemy against the Jewish people, you're an enmity against God. It's very clear on how he speaks on this. Going a bit further, there are many verses, and this is a key point as well, because many people argue, well, why does Israel always have to go to war? Why do they have to do this? Why do they have to do that? And this is in our history. History is very important. All the political thinkers agree that the history is important to a people. For the national identity of a people, you have to have a history, and that history is important. One of the things that God instructs, and this you can look this up on your own, is that God says that the Israelites were to go and to, in some cases, conquer the land. Israel has, over the years, over the centuries, has fought battles to maintain its identity and its land. And one of the reasons why is Israel at some points in time didn't listen to God, didn't listen to Hashem, as we say. And so they got jammed up, and they got in trouble. And so they had to deal with the consequences. But it's always been a struggle. It's always been a historical struggle. And that still goes on. And Israel will never give up being who she is, because it's very important that our redemption, according to Jewish law, thought, and written scripture, comes from the land of Israel. Israel is to be the light unto the nations. It has to be there. It's an integral part of what makes this world what it is. And if it's not there, chaos envelops. All of our laws are based on the laws of Torah that we use in the modern world today. Laws like we shouldn't kill, and there's a difference between killing and murdering. Laws against stealing, laws against adultery, whatever the case may be. Those laws we use today because of Israel. And so our history, again, is important. One of the things that I find very important in all of this is that somebody asked the question, where does Zionism come from? And so I always recite the phrase, Ki mitzion tezeh Torah, u'davar Hashem meYerushalayim. Out of Zion shall come forth Torah, and out of Yerushalayim, the word of God. I always use that. Zionism is not just from Herzl, but it's always been. Mount Zion, always used in the Torah, in the Tanakh. I'll let you do your research on that. I'll let you find out what you need to know on that. But most importantly, and I brought a copy. I didn't bring a Torah scrolls with me, but what I did bring, for those who haven't seen it, is what I use for doing trope. But it's the Torah, written in Hebrew. Every line, every precept, every word, written, inspired by men of God. And that's what we go by. Not by UN documents, and not by thoughts of President Obama, and not by, ideologies from the political science department, the social justice movements that have basically been a thorn in our side, but by the written words of men who were inspired by God. And that's what's important. I have with me one of the classes that I took at Western. It's a book that I got from Western, and it's called Comparing Political Regimes, second edition by Dr. Alan Sirioff. And basically, one of the things I noted here, because I was discussing with a friend about Israel, is that he notes, and this book was recent, and you can get it at the university library, is that there are now 193 sovereign states. So I went and I turned to it, and I noted that of those 193, and Dr. Sirioff, I'm sure, did his research very thoroughly, Palestine is not one of them. In fact, the name Palestine comes from the origins of Philistia. And according to what I researched briefly for doing this talk, the term Philistia is used 10 times in the Torah, basically, 10 times. The boundaries are never defined. The boundaries for Israel are defined. If we can go to the next slide. The name Philistine changed sometime after the Byzantine period to Palestine. That's the English version. But this map I found from 1899, we can't really see it, all the names on that map, But when I looked at that map, I didn't find not one single Arab city, like Jenin, Nablus. I didn't find Qalqilia. I didn't find any of the Ramallah. Those don't exist. This is a map from 1899. If you go on Google, Google maps of Israel, that particularly came up, that one came up. And I want you to look for Arab names of cities, because the claim with the PA Authority, Hamas, and everybody else in the Arab world seems to be that, well, we were always here. We always had a land, and we had all these cities, and this city was here from the time of Ishmael. But then how is it that it was never documented? Somebody had to do some research to find out that those places either existed or they didn't, and they're not on there. And so again, our history is based on a Torah. Shiloh, one of the first places where the Mishkan, the tabernacle, for those who are Christians who know it, that was built. It still exists today. Actually, if you go through Judea and Samaria, you take Highway 60, you can go and this small town, and the remnants of that are still there. You can go in the Torah or the Bible, and you can find what God told Moses to do, how to build the Mishkan, everything that was done for the sacrifices. All the artifacts are there. And all we have to do is do the research. And the problem is today that people listen to sound bites and they don't do the research. And so they come out, with these signs, oh yeah, free, free Palestine. And there's a wealth of knowledge. I told that to a professor over at King's College, because he was of the idea that Israel was born out of the ashes of Europe. And he stopped short before I ripped into him of saying that it was concocted by people that were in the Holocaust. He was a real piece of work. I have no problem saying that. And so I told him, I said, you know what? Here's a seminary library, and I guarantee you, if you go over there, you'll find plenty of evidence regarding Israel and its origins. And he didn't want to do that. Now, here's a guy who has a PhD, and he's telling me, well, don't you watch CNN? I said, could I do my papers based on watching a segment of CNN? Absolutely not. It just never ceases to amaze me, the type of people that supposed to have intelligence and teach us, but yet when it comes to doing research, they tell you to look at sound bites. And nobody wants to do that. And so that's the problem today we're dealing with. And so my argument's always been going back to basics. Actually, people say, well, you're not politically correct. And I say, no, I'm not politically correct at all. I'm biblically correct. That's my argument. And actually, I use that argument, I shut people down, and they've got to think, and they've got to do the research. So that's my stance on the Jewish case for Israel. It's based on our Torah. It's based on what men inspired by God were told to do. It's based on a specific area of land that was given to us by God, and that's what we hold to. And that's what Rabbi Kahana believed in. And that's what King David, who didn't build a temple, but his son Shlomo or Solomon built the first temple. And that's where it is in Jerusalem. They weren't inspired by, news media back then. They didn't have that. So they understood their history. And the history is important. And what the news media tries to do is erase our history. When it looks at settlers that are out in Judea and Samaria, it says, oh, well, they're going off this thing of the Torah. Well, that's what it is. That's what it's based on. You think people would just get up and just do this for the sake of doing it? No. There's a fervency in their belief, in their faith. And it's based on the book. And that's my argument. And thank you very much for having me. And good night.